Forget missiles. Forget warships. The real explosion may have already happened on a microphone in a single line that changed the entire battlefield. In a matter of hours, a narrative meant to weaken Iran triggered the exact opposite effect, transforming pressure into something far more dangerous: absolute cohesion. What looked like a routine political jab suddenly became the opening move in a high-stakes psychological showdown. As global attention locks onto Islamabad, the negotiations everyone expects to shape the future haven't even started, but the balance of power may already be shifting. One side tried to expose cracks, the other erased them completely. And now, the biggest question isn't what happens at the table. It's whether the outcome has already been decided before anyone even sits down. In the theater of modern conflict, the most devastating weapons do not always come equipped with a countdown timer. They do not drop from the bays of stealth bombers. They do not launch from fortified underground silos hidden deep in the mountains. Sometimes, the most lethal strike in a geopolitical standoff is a single sentence, a string of words delivered into a microphone, engineered to shatter a deeply held illusion, paralyze an adversary's decision-making matrix, and completely rewrite the rules of engagement before a single shot is ever fired. Welcome to the invisible, high-stakes battle space of narrative warfare. Today, we are looking at a masterclass in cognitive dominance. We are witnessing a brutal, real-time collision of psychological operations, strategic framing, and perception management playing out right now between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are currently standing on the absolute precipice of a massive, potentially history-altering diplomatic and geopolitical showdown in Islamabad. The stakes could not be higher. The entire architecture of Middle Eastern security hangs in the balance. And right now, right before the heavy wooden doors to the negotiating room are scheduled to open, a shadow war of perception has just detonated out in the open. It started with what appeared to be a standard, calculated poke from Donald Trump, a deliberate attempt to shape the narrative battleground. It ended, however, with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian metaphorically burning his own boats on the shoreline, tearing off the velvet mask of diplomacy, and locking the United States into a psychological corner from which there is no easy, face-saving escape. This is not a journalistic story about who is telling the objective truth. In the realm of cognitive warfare, the objective truth is largely irrelevant. The only metric that matters is who controls the narrative, who shapes the perception of the enemy, who dictates the boundaries of reality, and who establishes absolute psychological dominance before the first hand is shaken at the summit. Let us break down exactly how the Iranian state apparatus just took an American psychological operation, absorbed its kinetic energy, and turned it into a weapon of mass deterrence. Let us examine how the West's 40-year-old diplomatic playbook has just been systematically ripped to shreds in the public square. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of what just happened over the last few hours, we have to look very closely at the bait that was thrown into the water. Donald Trump, stepping onto the global public stage, delivered a highly specific, highly weaponized claim. He stated, unequivocally, that Iran is suffering from deep internal divisions. He painted a vivid picture of a fractured leadership. He described a government tearing itself apart from the inside, torn between competing factions, with a ruling system cracking under the immense weight of its own internal contradictions, economic sanctions, and domestic unrest. To the untrained eye, or the casual consumer of cable news, this simply looks like standard political rhetoric. It looks like an American politician taking a routine swipe at a legacy adversary. But if you analyze this through the cold, unforgiving lens of information operations, this was a highly targeted psychological strike. It was a cognitive flashbang. Why? Because in the ruthless arena of geopolitics, a divided nation is a vulnerable nation. A fractured leadership cannot maintain credible deterrence. Deterrence relies on the enemy's absolute certainty that if they cross a red line, your response will be swift, unified, and devastating. But if your enemy genuinely believes that your military high command and your civilian government are at each other's throats, they will not respect your red lines. They will not fear your military parades. They will squeeze you. They will apply maximum economic and covert pressure. They will walk into a high-stakes negotiation room at a place like Islamabad believing they possess the ultimate leverage. They will believe they can play one side of your government against the other. Trump's messaging was a textbook example of a divide-and-conquer framing tactic. He was attempting to systematically strip Tehran of its psychological armor right before the critical talks. He was trying to establish the baseline narrative that the American delegation would be negotiating with a weak, desperate, disorganized, and fractured regime. It was a trap, a carefully laid cognitive snare designed to force the Iranian state onto the defensive. Normally, when an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian nation is publicly accused of being internally divided, they panic. They scramble to hide the institutional cracks. They issue weak, bureaucratic, defensive denials through lower-level spokespeople that only serve to make them look more guilty and more disjointed. They over-explain. They bleed credibility in their desperate attempt to project normalce. But the Islamic Republic of Iran did not stumble into this trap. They did not play the role of the panic victim. They looked at the bait, picked it up off the ground, and used it to bludgeon the American narrative to death. Within hours of Trump's statement, the Iranian apparatus reacted. But it was not a scramble. It was not a panicked flail. It was a perfectly synchronized, overwhelming, and highly disciplined barrage of strategic messaging. From the foreign ministry, to the senior clerical establishment, to the top-tier commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the message that flooded the information zone was identical. It was a monolithic wall of sound. They saturated the media battle space with a unified theme of total institutional alignment. But the true kill shot, the absolute masterstroke of modern narrative, warfare came from the president of Iran himself, Masoud Pezeshkian. President Pezeshkian stepped to the microphone and delivered a statement that should logically send a chill down the spine of every Western intelligence analyst, every military planner, and every diplomat currently packing their briefcases for the Islamabad summit. He did not just issue a sterile denial of Trump's claim. He did not just say, "We are not divided." Instead, he went straight for the jugular of Western strategic thinking. He destroyed the foundational premise of Western foreign policy toward the Middle East. Pezeshkian said, and this is the specific framing that changes the entire trajectory of the conflict: there are no hardliners or moderates among Iranians. We are all Iranians. He then deliberately highlighted the absolute, unbreakable alignment between the political leadership, the armed forces, and the Iranian populace. You need to pause and understand exactly why this specific sequence of translated words is so incredibly dangerous to Western interests. This is not just patriotic posturing for a domestic audience. This is the deliberate, calculated assassination of a very specific, very useful Western geopolitical myth. For decades, spanning multiple American administrations, the intelligence, communities, and foreign policy establishments in Washington, London, and Paris have relied on a comforting psychological crutch. They have essentially convinced themselves and their voters that the Iranian government is neatly and conveniently divided into two opposing camps. On one side, you have the so-called hardliners. This includes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the supreme leader, the religious zealots, and the military hardchargers who fund proxy militias and chant death to America in the streets of Tehran. On the other side, you have the so-called moderates, the reformists, the civilian politicians, the Western-educated diplomats, the pragmatists who wear tailored suits, who smile politely for the international cameras, who negotiate in Vienna and Geneva, and who supposedly harbor a secret desire to integrate Iran back into the global financial system. This framing the eternal struggle of the moderate versus the hardliner has been the absolute bedrock of Western diplomatic strategy. It is the exact narrative architecture that justified the creation of the Iran nuclear deal. It is the logic that justifies every secret back-channel negotiation in Oman or Qatar. The West tells itself a very soothing story. If we just empower these moderates, if we just give them a little bit of economic relief, if we just give them a diplomatic victory to take home, they will eventually overpower the dangerous hardliners, and we can avoid a catastrophic theater-wide kinetic war. The moderate Iranian is a psychological construct that the West desperately needs to exist. It is the only thing that allows Western leaders to sell the concept of diplomacy to their own deeply skeptical domestic audiences. And here is the critical context. Masoud Pezeshkian was supposed to be the ultimate moderate. When he recently secured the presidency, Western media conglomerates plastered his face across the internet. They eagerly labeled him the reformist, the pragmatist, the doctor, the man who could pull Iran back from the brink of total isolation. He was the West's great shining hope for a softer, more pliable, more rational Tehran. And with one single, devastating sentence, Pezeshkian looked directly into the lens of the international media and said, "The man you are looking for does not exist." By aggressively declaring that there are no moderates and no hardliners, Pezeshkian voluntarily stripped off the velvet glove of diplomacy to reveal the bare iron fist underneath. He effectively broadcasted a message directly to Washington. You are not talking to a reformist civilian government that is desperately trying to hold back a radical, rogue military. You are talking to the military. We are one and the exact same entity. The civilian government is the IRGC, and the IRGC is the civilian government. Our goals are identical. Our threshold for pain is identical. Our willingness to escalate is identical. This is what intelligence professionals call narrative judo. It is the weaponization of the opponent's own momentum. Trump tried to use the perception of division to fatally weaken Iran's posture. Iran immediately used that exact same accusation as a golden pretext to declare total, unbreakable, militarized unity. They took a tactical, low-level poke and turned it into a strategic bulldozer. Let us look closely at the sheer psychological pressure this maneuver now exerts on the real-world battlefield and specifically on the fast-approaching negotiations in Islamabad. Diplomacy, stripped of its polite formalities, is nothing more than a game of leverage. It is a bloodless war of attrition. If you walk into a summit room to negotiate with a divided, fractured team, you immediately start scanning for the softest target. You offer targeted economic concessions to the moderates to incentivize them to fight the hardliners on your behalf. You use the threat of secondary sanctions to turn the civilian business sector against the military apparatus. You exploit every single millimeter of daylight you can find between their internal factions. But what happens to your strategy when your adversary suddenly turns the stadium lights on and shows you that there is absolutely no daylight? What happens when the man sitting across the mahogany table, the man your intelligence briefings assured you was the reasonable one, looks you in the eye and tells you that he fully and unreservedly endorses the maximalist, uncompromising, militant stance of the Revolutionary Guards? Your leverage vanishes. The psychological high ground you thought you held simply evaporates into the air. By weaponizing this concept of total unity, Iran has established an impenetrable cognitive perimeter around the Islamabad summit. They are proactively dictating the terms of engagement before anyone even pulls out a chair to sit down. The message being transmitted to the American delegation is brutal, clear, and uncompromising. Do not bring your wedge issues into this room. Do not try to play our domestic factions against each other, because we have formally abolished our factions. You will either meet our core demands in their totality, or you will walk away from this table and face the combined, unified, highly synchronized wrath of the entire Iranian state infrastructure. Iran is no longer playing defense in the information space. They have violently seized the initiative. They are the ones currently shaping the perception of the battlefield. In the dark art of narrative warfare, he who defines the reality of the situation controls the ultimate outcome. Trump attempted to define the geopolitical reality as Iran is crumbling under pressure. Pezeshkian counterattacked and redefined reality as Iran is a single-minded war machine, preparing for zero-sum conflict. And because Pezeshkian's narrative was instantly backed by the immediate, coordinated chorus of the entire Iranian military and clerical establishment, his reality became the dominant operational reality. The burden of proof shifted instantly and heavily back to the United States. Think about the intense cognitive dissonance this is currently creating inside the sterile briefing rooms of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the State Department. For months, highly paid analysts have been crafting psychological dossiers and strategic pathways based on the fundamental assumption that Pezeshkian would desperately need a diplomatic win at Islamabad to secure his own precarious domestic political position against the hardline clerics. The Americans built a massive, complex diplomatic strategy around the idea of offering this man a political lifeline. Now, they are forced to mentally rip up those dossiers. They have to face the terrifying prospect that Pezeshkian does not want their lifeline, that he views their lifeline as an insult, that he is perfectly comfortable and entirely politically secure, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most aggressive anti-Western elements of his military. By voluntarily burning the boats on the shore, By publicly destroying the moderate illusion, Iran has dramatically, exponentially raised the stakes of the entire game. They have deliberately removed their own safety net. When a sovereign nation actively removes its own diplomatic safety net, it is signaling to its adversaries that it is fully prepared for the absolute worst-case scenario. This is a classic, high-end deterrence maneuver. Deterrence, in the modern age, is not just about counting how many ballistic missiles you have hidden in a bunker. Deterrence is about making the enemy genuinely believe in their bones that you possess the unshakable political will to actually launch them. Internal division implies hesitation. It implies that a launch order might be countermanded. It implies that fear of economic ruin might override the desire for military retaliation. But total unity implies a finger resting heavily and permanently on the trigger without a single dissenting voice in the command center to pull it back. This brings us to the much broader, systemic implications for the global information war. What we are witnessing right now is the sudden, violent death of the Western framing of Middle Eastern power dynamics. For far too long, Western media, think tanks, and intelligence agencies have arrogantly projected their own domestic political structures onto their foreign adversaries. In the West, we have left-wing and right-wing political parties. So we assume our enemies have moderates and hardliners. We operate with intricate systems of checks and balances. So we assume our adversaries possess internal, institutional friction that we can easily exploit for our own gain. Iran has just proven, definitively, that they understand our psychological blind spots vastly better than we understand theirs. They know perfectly well that the Western foreign policy establishment is hopelessly addicted to the narrative of the internal Iranian political struggle. It is the lens through which the West views everything. By abruptly starving the West of that specific narrative, by denying them that specific framing, Iran induces strategic paralysis in Washington. So, where does this leave us? What are the escalation scenarios from here? Where does this cognitive battle transition into kinetic reality? We must look at the immediate future through the lens of potential strategic reactions. Scenario 1 is what we in the analytical space call the kinetic callout. The United States and its regional allies, particularly Israel, realizing that their psychological operation has failed and that Iran has successfully consolidated its deterrence narrative, might decide to aggressively test this newfound unity. In the physical world, how does this happen? The US or Israel might launch a highly calibrated, limited cyber attack on Iranian infrastructure, or authorize a high-profile proxy strike against IRGC assets in Syria, Iraq, or Lebanon. The goal here would not be military defeat, but psychological probing. It would be a strike specifically designed to see if the Iranian civilian government will scramble to backchannel and de-escalate, while the IRGC publicly pushes for massive retaliation. If Iran hesitates in its response, if backchannels open up begging for a ceasefire, the unity narrative instantly fractures. The US proves that Pezeshkian was bluffing, but this scenario is extraordinarily dangerous. If Iran truly is as unified as Pezeshkian claims, a kinetic test will not result in hesitation. It will result in an immediate, disproportionate, and totally unified counterstrike. The United States would essentially be kicking a hornet's nest purely to see if the hornets are actually working together. The risk of accidentally triggering a theater-wide regional war over a psychological test is catastrophically high. Scenario 2 is the Islamabad Stonewall. The American delegation arrives at the negotiations, takes their seats, and attempts to call Iran's bluff strictly through diplomatic friction. They offer a proposal that is intentionally designed to appeal only to the civilian economic sector. They offer sanctions, relief on civilian goods, banking, and oil exports. But they completely ignore or actively punish the security and regional demands of the IRGC. They push the paper across the table and wait to see if Pezeshkian's representatives blink. They wait to see if the lure of hundreds of billions of dollars in economic relief is enough to break the supposed ironclad unity. If the Iranians hold the line, if they reject the American proposal outright, and refuse to even take it back to Tehran for internal debate, the unity narrative solidifies from a rhetorical claim into concrete, undeniable reality. The talks collapse, but they do not collapse because of a minor disagreement on uranium enrichment percentages. They collapse because the entire foundational structure of the American negotiation strategy was built on a mirage that Iran has just vaporized. Scenario 3 is the intelligence trap. In this scenario, the United States refuses to concede the narrative battlefield. To counter Pezeshkian's claim of total unity, American or Israeli intelligence agencies might decide to selectively declassify and leak intercepted communications. They might drop highly sensitive signals, intelligence into the Western press audio recordings, hacked emails, or intercepted phone calls that definitively prove intense, bitter infighting between the IRGC generals and Pezeshkian's cabinet. This would be a devastating counterattack in the information war. It would publicly humiliate the Iranian president and instantly restore the American framing of a divided, weak adversary. However, burning highly classified intelligence sources just to score a victory in a public narrative battle is a massive gamble. It exposes collection methods and tells the Iranians exactly how their communications are compromised. Furthermore, if the leaked intelligence is ambiguous, or if the Iranians successfully spin it as an AI-generated deepfake or a Zionist fabrication, the U.S. effort will backfire completely, further reinforcing the Iranian narrative that America is desperate and deceptive. Scenario 4 is the alliance flex. Iran does not just stop at declaring domestic unity. They instantly pivot to projecting international unity. Having neutralized the American attempt to divide them internally, Tehran uses the momentum to visibly lock arms with Moscow and Beijing. In the days leading up to Islamabad, we might see sudden, unannounced visits by top Russian defense officials to Tehran, or announcements of massive new Chinese investment deals in Iranian energy infrastructure. This turns the cognitive pressure back on the United States tenfold. The message morphs from, "You cannot divide us," to, "We are part of an untouchable global bloc." Iran uses the failed American psychological operation as the ultimate proof to its allies that Washington acts in bad faith, thereby accelerating the multipolar push against American hegemony. America walks into Islamabad not just facing a unified Iran, but feeling the heavy, over-the-shoulder gaze of the entire Eurasian axis. But as it stands right now, at this exact second, as the dust settles from this opening salvo, Tehran is holding the absolute high ground. They are acting, operating, and communicating like the apex predator in the information battle space. They did not shy away from the conflict. They took a low-level, speculative, potentially damaging claim from an American president, and they masterfully weaponized it to undergo a massive, highly public, institutional metamorphosis. They shed the old, tired skin of the reasonable, divided, easily manipulated state. In its place, they revealed a hardened, singular, militarized entity. This was not a defensive reaction. Let that be absolutely clear. This was a preemptive, highly calculated strike on the minds of Western negotiators and policymakers. As the clock mercilessly ticks down to the opening statements at Islamabad, the United States finds itself in a profoundly uncomfortable, strategically disorienting position. The meticulously crafted diplomatic playbook they brought to the table is suddenly obsolete. The men they thought they were negotiating with the soft-spoken moderates they hoped to manipulate do not exist. The comforting illusion of a fractured, desperate Iran was the only thing making the prospect of Western diplomacy seem viable and relatively low risk. Now, that illusion has been forcefully stripped away. The moderate mask is lying in shattered pieces on the floor, and Iran is making no effort to pick it up. Western leaders have spent decades hoping, praying, and planning for a divided Iran that would eventually defeat itself from the inside out through sheer political friction. But what Masoud Pezeshkian just broadcasted to the entire world is a stark, unforgiving warning that permanently changes the calculus of global security. You cannot divide what has already fused together under pressure. You cannot manipulate a political friction that has been formally, publicly abolished by the state. When the doors close at Islamabad, America will not be sitting across from pliable diplomats looking for a desperate economic compromise. They will be sitting across from a unified, fully mobilized, ideologically locked war machine that has already won the critical opening battle for the narrative. And in the cold, merciless arithmetic of modern, 21st century conflict, once you lose control of the narrative, once your adversary dictates the reality of the battle space, the war itself is already halfway lost. The psychological trap has been definitively sprung. The metaphorical boats are burning brightly on the shoreline, visible to the whole world. And the Islamic Republic of Iran has just calmly informed the United States that they are no longer looking for a way out. They are looking straight ahead, and they are moving forward, not as a collection of factions, but as one unstoppable, unified force.